I wanted to ask you about what comes next, because Israel and the United States are doing what they do best. They're in their situation rooms talking about how they can escalate the situation and retaliate themselves. So Israel wants to hit nuclear sites because they believe if they hit nuclear sites, that will make them unable to obtain or build up nuclear weapons, the big nuclear threat. Of course, the human ramifications of that are really grave. The U.S. is trying to steer them, it seems like, to oil fields, which also has massive ramifications as well. But as all this is happening, Ben, you have Israel bombing Lebanon, mass murdering civilians and displacing 1 million already from that country. And you also have a ground invasion of southern Lebanon, which isn't going too well for Israel right now. There are reports that upwards of 60 plus Israeli troops have already been killed. This is not just injured. They've already been wiped out because of Hezbollah and other resistance groups. Their ambushes just being too much to handle. Actually, there are reports that Israeli tanks just couldn't actually cross the border because of these ambushes. So, Ben, your reaction to these escalations, because this is fast, this regional war that we have been talking about for many, many, many months now, since the the October 7th prison break happened. Ever since then, it's been building up to this point, and now it seems like we're rapidly moving toward this.
Yeah, a few points. First of all, this idea that the U.S. is saying Israel should strike oil facility in Iran. It's also incredible. I mean, not only is this an act of terrorism, Iran only targeted military sites in Israel. That's why, Israeli propagandists have been boasting no Israeli civilians were killed in this Iranian attack. Boasting, as if that were something good, because it shows that the Israeli genocidal regime, it measures how effective a military attack is in the number of dead civilians. So they say, look, in Gaza, we've killed tens of thousands of women and children. Look how successful we are. Whereas Iran says, no, we don't want to kill civilians because we're not insane genocidal terrorists like you maniacs. We're going after your military infrastructure, which we can and will hit. And there's also the point of the military censor in Israel. This is an important point. It's not really mentioned in the corporate media. Israel has a very strict military censor that controls everything that the so-called free independent media in Israel reports, which it's not, like in the US, they claim to have free independent media. It's actually just US regime propaganda media. In the Israeli regime, it's also Israeli regime propaganda. And they say nothing happened in this attack. Joe Biden said we intercepted the missiles, nothing happened. But on social media, there are so many videos that have been circulating of people in Israel just looking up because, Iran did this missile attack at night and you could see the hundreds of missiles going across. You can see it very clearly. You can see dozens of them landing. I've seen different estimates. We don't know exactly how many, but at the very least, we know that this idea that almost none of the missiles struck, that's a lie. What the U.S. and Israel are saying, it's a complete lie. Now, as for what Iran says about 90%, I don't know. But certainly we can see that dozens of missiles hit their targets, including military sites, including allegedly the Mossad headquarters of the Israeli spy agency. So this also symbolically says a lot. Iran and its allies, resistance forces in the region that are not proxies. Hezbollah is not an Iranian proxy. Hezbollah is a Lebanese indigenous resistance organization that has its origins in the resistance against Israel's illegal occupation of South Lebanon after Israel invaded South Lebanon in 1982 and maintained an occupation until 2000, and then invaded in 2006 again. The point is that these are not Iranian proxy groups. They are indigenous resistance groups. But the point is that Iran and these resistance groups, they hit Israeli military targets, not civilians, whereas Israel and the U.S. target civilians. I mean, you look at Gaza. That is Israel's intention, is to destroy all of the hospitals and destroy all of the UN-sponsored schools that have been used as refugee shelters. That's why every single week there's another report of another UN school being bombed by Israel, because this is intentional. They're destroying all of the civilian infrastructure to make life unsustainable, to starve and dehydrate Palestinians. This is genocide. Now, As for the U.S. saying, okay, well, Israel should do another terror attack on Iran's oil facilities, not Iran's military facilities, their oil facilities. This is, first of all, terrorism. Second of all, it's hilarious because the U.S. has an election coming up in a month, and what they're asking for is a massive spike in global oil prices. So throughout this war, this genocide that Israel's been carrying out, one of the most surprising things is actually the stability in global oil markets. A big reason for that, I think, is that most people did not expect the war to continue to expand. Now it is expanding. And also because the U.S., this is, when in terms of geopolitical analysis, I think this is one of the factors that is almost never mentioned, which is one of the most important qualitative shifts in the past 2 decades, which is that the U.S. is actually now the world's largest oil producer. Yeah. Obama boasted about that.
Yes,
in a meeting he held with a bunch of oil executives in Russia,
exactly.
And a bunch of oil executives in Texas, Texas. And in this, he said, you know, people on Wall Street, they complain. He's like, did you look where your stocks were when I started office and where I left? Just say thank you. And Obama boasted of turning the U.S. into the world's largest oil producer. But anyway, the point is that if Israel bombs significant Iranian oil infrastructure, at the very least, even if it doesn't significantly influence oil production globally, because Iran, it's a significant producer, but you know, it's not one of the top 5 producers. Still, it's going to have probably a significant impact on global oil prices. It will probably lead to global oil prices rising, or even if, you know, because the problem is that all of these commodities markets, their value is determined by speculators, not even necessarily what actually happens, but about expectations of what will happen. So if most speculators think that it's going to happen, before it even happens, the prices will change, which means that there's all this pressure on prices rising in the oil market internationally, which means that we see now a month coming up before elections, gas prices will probably increase in the US a few weeks before the election, which is only going to hurt Harris, the Biden-Harris camp. I mean, so these genius strategists in Washington who are encouraging oil prices to go up a few weeks before their election. I mean, they're doing their own October surprise against themselves. I mean, insane. As for Lebanon, you know, there are all these reports in the Western media, these triumphalist reports claiming Israel decapitated Hezbollah. Yes. Hezbollah has been destroyed. They do not understand Hezbollah. I mean, first of all, again, all these propagandists keep claiming that Hezbollah is an Iranian proxy group. It is not an Iranian proxy group. Hezbollah, again, has its origins in the indigenous Lebanese resistance against Israel's illegal invasion and occupation of South Lebanon in the 1980s and 90s. Yes, they have received support from Iran, just like Israel has received tens of billions of dollars of support from the U.S. Yeah. But the idea that, I mean, it's outrageous, this idea that Hezbollah just obediently does whatever Iran wants. That's not what's actually happening. And in the case of the resistance against Israel, this idea that they could just decapitate the group by killing all the leaders. Well, what does decapitation mean? It means you cut off the head and that kills the rest of the organism. That's certainly not what has happened in Hezbollah. This is an organization that has a history of its leadership being murdered by the Israeli regime, including in 1992. Abbas al-Hanawi was murdered by the Israeli regime. And what happened? Then Hassan Nasrallah, the most legendary resistance leader in the region, came to power. And he was the head of Hezbollah for 3 decades. And he turned Hezbollah into this extremely powerful force to be reckoned with that we see today. So Israel thinks they can just kill the leadership and this organization will go away. But in reality, they have been preparing for years for Israel to do exactly this. They knew that Israel could kill their leadership and had other many teams of other commanders prepared to step in and to become leaders. And this is exactly what has happened in Hezbollah. And also, the irony of this is that in the past year, Hezbollah has been trying to maintain a deterrent, striking back against Israel's acts of war. If you look, even, you know, the BBC has published this data. Bloomberg recently published data, and it shows that Israel has been hitting Lebanon like 7 or 8 more times than Hezbollah has been launching cross-border strikes into Israel. So Israel is very clearly the aggressor here. 7 or 8 more times attacks on Lebanon than Lebanese attacks on Israel in the past year. Israel can maintain that because it does have an advantage in terms of military equipment, largely because the U.S. just keeps refilling all of these military supplies, sending more artillery shells, more missiles, more bombs, billions and billions of dollars of support. However, where Hezbollah has the advantage is on the ground fighting. The IDF is full of a bunch of cowardly colonialists who have little to no experience. These are largely conscriptees who also have no morale. They're very afraid of fighting. Again, they're a bunch of cowards who are used to bombing women and children trapped in the Gaza prison camp or launching these artillery strikes across the border into Lebanon. They're not used to actually having to fight trained soldiers on the ground, which is why even in Gaza, a region that has been completely under a brutal genocidal Israeli blockade that tried to prevent all weapons from going in, Lebanon has not been under an Israeli blockade in the same way. Hezbollah is very well equipped. They're well trained. And before Nasrallah was murdered in this cowardly attack by Israel that killed many civilians, before that, Hezbollah was saying, look, we're ready. Come in and we'll fight man to man and we will beat you because we actually are trained to do these kinds of things. We're not cowards. We're not only going to kill, we're not going to intentionally target Israeli women and children like you are doing in Gaza. And now we're seeing that the Israeli soldiers, the invaders in Lebanon, now see what it's actually like to fight against an equal foe that hasn't been under a blockade for 16 years and been unable to get any military equipment. And very quickly, I think the Israeli regime is going to see that it's impossible to maintain a ground occupation of South Lebanon. So what we'll probably see is just a massive intensification of the aerial bombardment and the shelling, because these are the cowards that are in the Israeli regime. They're certainly not willing to risk large casualties because morale is already so low. Any educated Israeli doctors, engineers.
Oh, oh no, Ben, I think you got cut off. Are you still here?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, okay. Yes. It's okay. Continue.
There's been massive brain drain in Israel. Doctors, engineers, scientists, they've all gotten out of there. Many of them have dual passports anyway, because, Israel's this Western colonial outpost. They've all gone to the US and Europe and Canada and Australia. So what's left is you have a population which tend to be the underprivileged people, not as wealthy, and many of them are conscripted. They have no morale. Why would they fight? Why would they sacrifice their lives? Meanwhile, in Lebanon, you have these people who have been training for many years. They saw the barbarism of the Israeli destruction of Lebanon, of Beirut in 2006. These are nationalists who also are motivated by a liberation theology form of Islam. They truly believe that they are defending their homeland. They believe that they have God on their side, and they are willing to fight. They will defend their sovereignty. I mean, again, if you look at the U.S., the U.S. has lost every major war that it's been in since World War II. So they're just as cowardly as the Israeli colonialists. Their solution is bomb the hell out of every country we're at war with. We have air advantage. We don't want to lose our soldiers because we're cowards and we have low morale. So we're just going to bomb everyone, kill all the women and children, try to destroy everything, like they did in Iraq, like they did in many other countries. And eventually they end up losing. So, Israel is used to just fighting people trapped in a prison camp who are just desperately trying to defend their sovereignty. They have no idea what they're in for with Hezbollah. I mean, they believe this is what's dangerous. When you start believing your own propaganda, it's very dangerous.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yes, Ben, because I mean, what's so interesting about this is a big part of that dropped morale, this like incredible, Israel is an engine that runs on, I guess the simplistic term is hate, but really it's just incredible racism, just like one of the strongest forms of racism, just the idea that you are superior to all this. It runs on that militarily, and it's part of the reason why it believes it can just send in its Merkava tanks, and it could send in these so-called silent elite units into southern Lebanon, where Hezbollah is just waiting for them in on their terrain. They know what it's not like there hasn't been 3 to 4 prior conflicts between the armed resistance of Lebanon and Israel, but yet they still believe they can do this, and it's already produced just such terrible results for Israel, on top of the fact that a big reason why that morale has dropped is because they've been waging a genocidal campaign in Gaza, which hasn't defeated the resistance in Palestine either. It hasn't defeated them. There's always these mini reports that kind of pop up in the Western mainstream media where they'll say, oh, no, Hamas, and they don't talk about the other resistance, but they say Hamas is regrouping, right? You hear that. I've heard that maybe every other week in the Western mainstream media. They're regrouping. Well, how are they regrouping? I thought they were being bombed to smithereens. No, they're still fighting. And that's because Israel hasn't been able to supposedly complete their objectives, because ultimately it seems like the objectives for Israel is to try to wipe away the entire terrain that is threatening their expansion, their expansion. And maybe you can talk about these actual goals, because I think it's not discussed enough. There's often, okay, we're a year at this genocide. Okay, now Lebanon. Okay, now Israel, Iran. But really, there's a larger objective here for Israel that U.S. support really does fuel, that the U.S., whether they agree with it or not, a particular administration, a particular sect of the political class, whatever divisions might exist, there's obviously uniformity in support for Israel, which means supporting this broader goal. Could you talk about these expansionist goals of Israel?
Yeah, this has not been hidden by Israeli officials. The Israeli Minister of Diaspora Affairs published this insane tweet in Hebrew on Twitter. People joke that if you translate what Israeli regime officials say in Hebrew, not what they say in English, but in Hebrew, it's like undiscovering lost pages of Mein Kampf. I mean, these are insane genocidal maniacs. And in one of these tweets from this Israeli minister, he said, "We do not recognize the sovereignty of Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq." He said they're not real countries. And he said, we must retake South Lebanon. So openly saying, these are not real countries. We want to colonize them. And we're going to start with colonizing South Lebanon, like Israel did in the 80s and 90s. We also saw this Israeli minister, the Minister of Education, went on Channel 14, which has been, this far-right extremist
always
propaganda
him
network.
too, Ben. It's always like he is absolutely right out of the book, right out of the pages of Mein Kampf. Anyway, continue.
Yeah, absolutely. So on Channel 14 is this far-right Israeli propaganda channel, just pro-Netanyahu propaganda. And an Israeli human rights organization found that since October, in 1 year, it has transmitted over 50 open calls for genocide of Palestinians. But in this interview on Channel 14, the Israeli education minister said, Lebanon will be annihilated. Lebanon, as we know, will no longer exist. Both, again, using the same kind of genocidal rhetoric they were previously using against Palestinians, now also using against Lebanese. And you can just go down the list. Of course, another Israeli minister boasted that what they're doing is the continuation of the Nakba, which refers to the Arabic word for catastrophe, which means the mass ethnic cleansing of indigenous Palestinians back in 1948. So they want to continue that. They're complaining that they never were able to genocide and ethnically cleanse all indigenous Palestinians. So now they want to finish that project. Now, you mentioned a really important detail here about the previous Israeli invasions of Lebanon. This is the third Israeli invasion. Now, we should not forget that in the 80s, when Hezbollah was first created, in response to Israel's illegal 1982 occupation of Lebanon, invasion and then occupation of Lebanon, when Hezbollah was first created, it was a grassroots guerrilla organization. It was entirely, rooted in the people of South Lebanon picking up arms to defend themselves against this occupier. And then, since then, it has strengthened and strengthened. And in 2006, Israel waged another war of aggression against Lebanon and was defeated. Israel lost against Hezbollah in 2006. And then Hezbollah was much weaker than it is today. Hezbollah has had nearly 2 decades, 18 years to prepare for this war that we're seeing today. And in the meantime, Hezbollah got much stronger as many of its, not only its leadership, of course, some of them have been killed, but its fighters have been training. They had military experience in the war in Syria, in which, as I talked about earlier, in which the US, European countries, the Gulf regimes, and Israel were supporting the so-called rebels who were allied with ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria. So Hezbollah helped to defend the sovereignty of Lebanon as some of these fascist extremists like ISIS and Al-Qaeda were crossing over the western Syrian border crossing the eastern border of Lebanon and trying to take over some of these villages in Lebanon. What happened is that Hezbollah on the Lebanese side of the border was collaborating with the Syrian military on the Syrian side of the border to defeat ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And then, of course, in some other parts of the, crossing the eastern border of Lebanon, the western border of Syria, Hezbollah was helping to fight against ISIS. So they are hardened fighters. They have experience fighting against an insane genocidal enemy like Israel, which was ISIS. I mean, if you had to compare someone in a similar outlook who their solution, their military goal is to exterminate everyone. That's what ISIS was doing. That's what Israel is doing now. So Hezbollah has that experience. So the Hezbollah of today is much stronger than the Hezbollah of 2006, which defeated Israel. So do we really expect that Israel can win this time? This is the third time Israel's invaded.
Exactly.
They were pushed out, and then after the 80s and 90s, they were defeated when Hezbollah was weak. They were pushed out again in 2006 when Hezbollah was a little stronger. And now they expect to defeat Hezbollah when Hezbollah is stronger than it's ever been. But again, it reflects the colonial arrogance of the Israeli regime. It believes it's propaganda. It believes that Hezbollah is a so-called Iranian proxy. It believes that people in Hezbollah are just in a cult and they just worship Hassan Nasrallah. And if Israel can just kill the leadership, then everyone else will just go away. They'll go home. They'll go home and they'll allow Israel to recolonize their land. They cannot understand what it's like to be under foreign military occupation and to pick up arms to fight against the foreign occupier. Because in Lebanon, that's what people are doing. Israel is so used to being the oppressor, they can't imagine that the oppressed are actually willing to fight. And that's why they're in for a big wake-up call. We're already seeing this with reports of dozens of Israeli soldiers killed in just a few days. And that number is very likely going to increase. So unfortunately, what do I think is going to happen? I think ultimately Israel is going to, they won't completely end the invasion, the ground invasion, because then that would be admitting defeat. But I think they'll probably pull back some of their troops and then just massively intensify the carpet bombing of civilian areas using airstrikes and artillery to just flatten South Lebanon and maybe even Beirut, because those are the cowards in the Israeli regime. They can't win a conventional war, so they just bomb everything to smithereens. And the U.S. gives them the bombs and shells they need to do that.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyHaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.